The
I
wail
am
of a siren
ordering you
tore
to
through the
leave.
morning quiet of the provincial town.
I am
Not a
not
police
going
siren.
anywhere.
A military one. Black armored SUVs with tinted windows, emblazoned with strict army camouflage, cordoned off the central square, surrounding the county courthouse. The first to emerge were silent, fully equipped Special Forces soldiers in combat readiness, their weapons trained on the entrance. Behind them, swiftly and decisively, followed a group in sharp dark blue suits bearing U.S. military prosecution patches. Inside, the courtroom was in chaos. Local police officers, who moments ago had been lounging casually, now stood pressed against the walls, hands raised, their faces contorted with terror and bewilderment. Some tried to reach for their holsters, but their movements were cut short before they could even form, by harsh commands and the click of rifle bolts. Sheriff Boyd Corrigan, once the all-powerful master of this county, stood in the center of the room, broken and trembling. His blue uniform, usually immaculate, was now rumpled, his tie askew, and sweat beaded on his forehead. His arrogant face, which only hours before had exuded absolute confidence, was now ashen, his eyes darting frantically, searching for some anchor, but there was nothing around him but the cold metal of barrels and the indifferent faces of the military personnel. Two tall military police officers in Marine Corps uniforms took him firmly by the arms. Corrigan struggled desperately, trying to break free, but their grip was iron. He gasped for air, his words devolving into an incoherent mumble. At that moment, a tall, dark-skinned man in a perfectly tailored civilian suit walked unhurriedly through the crowd of soldiers. There was no malice in his eyes, only a weary resolve. This was Aaron Banks, a former Navy SEAL, whose calm demeanor sharply contrasted with the panicking sheriff. "You believed your authority was absolute, Sheriff." Banks' voice was quiet, yet it rang out like a verdict in the echoing silence. "You were mistaken. Grievously mistaken." Corrigan let out a hoarse, desperate cry as he was dragged toward the exit. His gaze darted to Banks, full of hatred and disbelief. The door slammed shut, separating him from the world he once unilaterally controlled. 184 days before. The air in the small county courthouse was thick with the scent of stale coffee and unfulfilled justice. Sunlight, filtered through grimy windows, cast long, dusty streaks across the worn wooden benches. For Aaron Banks, a man whose life had once been defined by the stark clarity of mission objectives and the camaraderie of elite units, the procedural tedium of civilian court was a frustratingly alien landscape. Today, however, it was his battleground. Aaron, a man whose presence commanded quiet respect even in a bespoke suit, sat patiently at the defense table. His posture was impeccable, a legacy of years spent as a Navy SEAL. His dark skin, framed by neatly trimmed hair, was unlined, but his eyes held the depth of experiences few could fathom. He was representing his younger sister, Maya, a dedicated and brilliant nurse, in what should have been a straightforward, if unfortunate, fender-bender case. A minor traffic incident had escalated due to the other driver's belligerence and, as Aaron suspected, the underlying currents of local prejudice that Maya, as a black woman in a predominantly white, rural county, often navigated with quiet dignity. Across the aisle, Sheriff Boyd Corrigan lumbered into the courtroom, a walking embodiment of unchecked local authority. His uniform, though crisp, seemed to strain at the seams, a testament to a lifestyle of comfort and self-indulgence. His face, ruddy and jowly, wore a perpetual smirk of self-satisfaction. Corrigan wasn't directly involved in the traffic incident, but he had a personal vendetta against Aaron. A few weeks prior, Aaron, with his quiet confidence and unwavering moral compass, had publicly, though subtly, challenged Corrigan's heavy-handed and racially biased policing tactics at a community meeting. The sheriff, unaccustomed to any form of public dissent, especially from someone who refused to be intimidated, had taken it as a profound personal insult. Now, as the prosecutor presented a flimsy case against Maya, Corrigan leaned back in the gallery, crossing his arms, a predatory glint in his eye. He exchanged knowing glances with Judge Caldwell, a man whose political career owed much to Corrigan's influence and whose courtroom was widely regarded as an extension of the sheriff's domain. The prosecutor, a nervous young man, seemed to take his cues more from Corrigan's silent signals than from any legal precedent. Aaron, observing the charade with cool detachment, presented Maya's defense with precision and an almost surgical dismantling of the prosecution's flimsy arguments. He cited traffic laws, presented photographic evidence, and called a neutral eyewitness who clearly corroborated Maya's account. The facts were overwhelmingly on their side. Maya, though shaken, held her head high, her trust in her brother unwavering. But in this courtroom, facts were merely suggestions. As Aaron concluded, confident that he had laid bare the truth, Sheriff Corrigan pushed himself to his feet. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for recognition. He simply began to speak, his voice booming with false authority. "Your Honor, with all due respect to Mr. Banks' eloquence," Corrigan began, his eyes fixed on Aaron, a sneer playing on his lips. "Everyone in this town knows how these people drive. Always in a hurry, always thinking the rules don't apply to them. This ain't about some fender bender, Your Honor. It's about maintaining order. And if we let people like her," he gestured dismissively towards Maya, "get away with this, what message does that send?" A hush fell over the courtroom, thick with unspoken racial prejudice. The judge shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing to rebuke the sheriff's outrageous interjection. Aaron felt a cold surge of controlled fury. This wasn't just an insult, it was a public degradation, an intentional act of racial intimidation and judicial interference, designed to humiliate Maya and, by extension, himself. It was a clear abuse of power, designed to demonstrate who truly held sway in this town. Aaron's gaze met Corrigan's. The sheriff's eyes burned with triumph, confident in his absolute impunity, reveling in the public spectacle. He had expected Aaron to react, to erupt in anger, to give him an excuse for a public scene. But Aaron's face remained a mask of serene composure. Inside, however, a switch had been flipped. The calm, almost meditative focus he'd cultivated in the most hostile environments now centered on a single, unwavering objective. He turned to Judge Caldwell, his voice steady, devoid of any discernible emotion. "Your Honor," Aaron said, "I believe we have heard enough. I move for a dismissal based on lack of evidence and the clear, unethical interference of an officer of the court." The judge, caught between the law and his powerful patron, hesitated, glancing at Corrigan. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, a silent command passing between them. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat, avoiding Aaron's gaze. "Motion denied," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Given the circumstances, I find for the plaintiff. Ms. Banks will be liable for all damages, and her license will be suspended for 60 days. Maya gasped, tears welling in her eyes. It was an impossible, unjust ruling, based on nothing but racial animus and raw power. Aaron, however, remained impassive. He simply nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of the outcome, but his gaze, when it briefly flickered back to Corrigan, held an icy glint. The sheriff's grin widened, mistaking Aaron's composure for defeat. He had no idea that, in that very moment, a silent, meticulous mechanism had just been activated. A mechanism far beyond the reach of Judge Caldwell, Sheriff Corrigan, or any local crony. A mechanism designed to dismantle systems, not just individuals. The moment they stepped out of the courthouse, the oppressive weight of injustice seemed to lift slightly, replaced by the crisp autumn air. Maya, however, remained visibly shaken. She clutched her hands, her shoulders slumped. "Aaron, how could they do that?" she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. There was no evidence. It was just him. Aaron gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. "I know, Maya. It was a kangaroo court. A complete sham." His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within him. He felt the familiar, almost electric hum of focus that had always preceded a critical mission. In the SEALs, this clarity was vital for survival, now, it was for justice. "But my license, and the money," Maya continued, her voice cracking. "They just want to make an example of me because of who I am." "And because of me," Aaron added, his gaze distant, fixed on the courthouse entrance where Corrigan's patrol car was just pulling away, the sheriff's smug profile visible through the tinted window. "He saw an opportunity to put me in my place, to send a message. And he used you to do it." There was no anger in his tone, only a chilling assessment of the situation. This wasn't personal for Aaron, not in the petty sense. It was about principle. It was about systemic corruption and the abuse of power, directly impacting someone he loved. They walked in silence for a few blocks, Aaron allowing Maya to process the immediate shock. He knew that for her, the wound was fresh and raw. For him, the decision had been made the instant Corrigan had opened his mouth in court. He had seen too many places where justice was bought and sold, where power crushed the innocent. He had joined the military to defend a system of laws, not to watch it be perverted by petty tyrants. They reached Aaron's car, a modest but meticulously maintained sedan. As Maya settled into the passenger seat, still visibly upset, Aaron pulled out his phone. It wasn't the latest model, but it was robust, encrypted, and contained contacts that few outside a very specific circle even knew existed. He scrolled to a name that read simply, Echo. Maya watched him, perplexed. Who's Echo? Someone who understands how certain systems operate, Aaron replied, his thumb hovering over the call button. Someone who can see things that are hidden from the public eye. He pressed call. The phone rang twice, then connected. Aaron, a calm, deep voice answered. To what do I owe the unexpected pleasure? I thought you were enjoying civilian life. Echo, Aaron said, his voice dropping to a low, professional cadence, the same one he used when briefing a mission. I need to activate Protocol Omega. A pause stretched on the line, heavy with unspoken understanding. Omega. Echo repeated, the single word carrying a weight of surprise and gravity. Are you absolutely certain, Aaron? You know what that entails. Once the gears start turning, they don't stop. I am, Aaron confirmed, his gaze meeting Maya's in the rearview mirror, a flicker of grim determination in his eyes. Today, in Judge Caldwell's courtroom, Sheriff Boyd Corrigan interfered with a legal proceeding, engaged in blatant racial prejudice, and coerced a judge into delivering an unjust verdict against my sister. All of it was caught on record, both official and unofficial, and there are witnesses. He omitted the details of Corrigan's personal insult, that wasn't relevant to the protocol. This was about procedure, about law, about evidence. Sheriff Corrigan, Echo mused, the name seeming to carry a newfound significance. Local potentate, I presume. Exactly, Aaron affirmed. Believes himself untouchable. This isn't just about Maya's case, Echo. This is about a pattern of behavior, a corruption of the local justice system that has gone unchecked for too long. He underestimated me. He underestimated us. Another brief silence. Then, Echo's voice returned, sharper, imbued with a new sense of purpose. Understood, Aaron. Consider Protocol Omega activated. We'll start with a discreet preliminary review. Expect nothing visible for a while. We move in shadows until we have undeniable proof. You know the drill. Keep a low profile. Act as if nothing has changed. Always do, Aaron said, a faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touching his lips. He ended the call, the phone returning to its place in his pocket. Maya stared at him, her brow furrowed. What just happened? What's Protocol Omega? Aaron started the car, pulling slowly out of the parking lot. It's a way, he said, his eyes on the road ahead, to remind certain people that there's a higher authority. An authority that doesn't care about local politics, personal vendettas, or the color of anyone's skin. It cares only about justice, and it has the resources to ensure it's delivered. He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. The gears were turning. The invisible war had just begun. The days following the courtroom travesty settled into an unnerving calm for Maya. She expected a backlash, further harassment from Corrigan's deputies, or at least a renewed sense of local animosity. But nothing came. The town continued its slow, predictable rhythm. The sheriff's patrol cars still cruised the streets, their presence a constant, low-level hum of intimidation, but they seemed to pay Maya no particular mind. The silence was almost more unsettling than overt aggression. Aaron maintained his quiet routine. He continued his work as an independent consultant, a civilian life he had painstakingly built after his years of service. To all outward appearances, he was simply a disgruntled brother who had lost a minor court case. He advised Maya to go about her life as normally as possible, to document everything, but to expect nothing. This was the first rule of the invisible war: make no sudden moves, betray no knowledge. Meanwhile, in an office far removed from the dusty courthouse, a file began to grow. Its contents were initially mundane: public records pertaining to Sheriff Boyd Corrigan, his political donations, local election results, and a handful of minor complaints against his department, mostly dismissed without investigation. But tucked within these routine documents were more telling details, gleaned from less conventional sources: encrypted communication logs, anonymous tips filtering through secure channels, and a quiet request for all available data on recent civil cases in Judge Caldwell's court involving disadvantaged parties. The recipient of Aaron's call, Commander Evelyn Thorne, echo to her most trusted contacts, sat at her desk, reviewing the nascent file. Thorne was a formidable woman, a JAG officer with a career marked by relentless pursuit of justice, often against powerful adversaries. She understood the weight of Protocol Omega. It was a rarely invoked directive, reserved for situations where systemic corruption directly threatened military personnel or their families, or where local civilian authorities demonstrated a pattern of unconstitutional behavior that warranted federal, and specifically military, intervention, given the unique position of active or former service members. Thorne knew Aaron well. They had served together, albeit in different capacities. She trusted his judgment implicitly. If Aaron Banks activated Omega, it meant the threat was not merely personal, but systemic, and deeply insidious. Her initial move was surgical and almost imperceptible, a request for an internal review of cross-jurisdictional incidents involving former service members and local law enforcement in the specified county. This was a bureaucratic smokescreen, designed to appear routine while granting her team access to a wealth of data. Back in the county, Sheriff Corrigan felt a flicker of something akin to annoyance. He'd received a few boilerplate emails, ostensibly from state-level law enforcement oversight committees, requesting routine data on department procedures and recent arrests involving former military personnel. He dismissed them as bureaucratic busywork, probably prompted by some new state initiative or an overzealous intern. He merely forwarded the requests to a junior deputy, ordering him to send them whatever standard nonsense we've got. Don't waste time on it. His focus remained on basking in his recent victory against Aaron Banks. He reveled in the subtle shifts in deference he now received, the unspoken acknowledgement that he had decisively put the uppity seal in his place. He genuinely believed that the incident was closed, a minor irritation dealt with, reinforcing his absolute authority. That'll teach him to challenge me, Corrigan grumbled to his chief deputy, Hank Miller, over lukewarm coffee and stale donuts in his office a week later. These city boys, they come back here, think they're special. Think they're above the way things work. Miller, a man whose loyalty to Corrigan was born of years of shared history and a healthy fear of the sheriff's unpredictable temper, merely grunted in agreement. He knows his place now, Sheriff. And that sister of his, too. But while Corrigan patted himself on the back, Thorne's team was meticulously sifting through the standard nonsense provided by the junior deputy. They found a shocking pattern. Over the past 5 years, a disproportionate number of arrests and citations for minor infractions, particularly those leading to significant fines or property forfeiture, were issued to black residents or low-income individuals. Many of these cases, like Maya's, had been adjudicated by Judge Caldwell with suspiciously swift and harsh verdicts. Even more damning were the subtle inconsistencies in the official reports, suggesting a systematic downplaying of excessive force complaints or a convenient loss of evidence in cases against Corrigan's favored constituents. The initial review was complete. The whispers in the wind were consolidating into a clear, damning narrative. Commander Thorne closed the file on her desk, its unassuming cover belying the explosive truth contained within. "It's worse than we thought," she murmured to herself. "Much worse." The higher power had arrived, not with a storm, but with the quiet, methodical precision of a predator stalking its prey. And Sheriff Corrigan, blinded by his arrogance, hadn't even noticed. Sheriff Corrigan's smug satisfaction began to fray around the edges, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a worn fabric. The initial flurry of routine data requests had given way to more specific inquiries. These weren't coming from the state, they were from a nebulous Department of Defense Inspector General's office, or sometimes simply Federal Oversight Committee for Military Personnel Affairs. The names sounded official, but they were unfamiliar, and the questions they posed were subtly intrusive. First, it was about departmental protocols for interactions with veterans and active duty personnel. Then, it escalated to requests for detailed records of all arrests involving individuals with military service in the last 5 years. Next, they asked for a comprehensive list of all complaints filed against Sheriff Corrigan or his deputies, regardless of outcome, along with the names of all judges who presided over those cases. Corrigan found himself increasingly irritated. He fumed at the audacity of these anonymous bureaucrats poking their noses into his county. "Who the hell are these people?" he barked at Deputy Miller one morning, tossing a printout of an email onto his desk. "Inspector General. What's a military inspector general doing sniffing around local traffic courts?" Miller, ever the pragmatist, tried to soothe him. "Probably just some new federal mandate, Sheriff." Post 9/11 stuff, you know. Keeping an eye on veterans' rights or something. Just send them the paperwork. Better to cooperate than to have them send an actual auditor. But Corrigan's unease deepened. The inquiries, though polite and strictly professional, felt pointed. They seemed to zero in on specific patterns that, until now, had been considered internal matters. He found himself spending more time than he liked digging through old files, trying to recall minor incidents that suddenly felt less minor under this new, unseen scrutiny. He even started to notice that Judge Caldwell seemed a little more distant, a little less eager to share a laugh at the local diner. What Corrigan couldn't see was the methodical, almost surgical precision with which Commander Thorne's team operated. They weren't sending out general requests, each query was a targeted probe, designed to verify specific pieces of information uncovered through their initial data sweep. They had identified a dozen other cases, mirroring Maya's, where black residents or low-income individuals, some of whom were veterans or had military family, faced egregious injustices in Caldwell's court, often with Corrigan's implicit or explicit involvement. They found patterns of excessive force complaints that mysteriously vanished, evidence logs that contained inexplicable gaps, and witness statements that were conveniently misplaced. One particular case began to emerge with disturbing clarity, that of Marcus Thorne, a decorated Army veteran who, 3 years prior, had been arrested by Corrigan's deputies on dubious drug charges, lost his small family farm to forfeiture, and served 2 years in prison before being inexplicably paroled. The official story was that he was a dealer, but the details in the internal reports didn't align. Thorne's case had all the hallmarks of a systematic abuse of power, perhaps even land expropriation under false pretenses. Commander Thorne, though outwardly composed, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach as she reviewed Marcus Thorne's file. The coincidence of the surname was purely that, a coincidence, but the sheer injustice of the case fueled her resolve. This was exactly the kind of systemic rot Protocol Omega was designed to excise. Her team began quietly interviewing former deputies, disgruntled courthouse clerks, and even local attorneys who had long harbored suspicions but feared Corrigan's reprisal. These interviews were conducted discreetly, often off the record, far from the county line, under the guise of general legal research or a military benefits review. The effect on the local system was like a silent, growing pressure. Judge Caldwell, sitting alone in his chambers, found himself reviewing old case files with increasing apprehension. He started to notice the patterns himself, the recurring names, the similar circumstances. He remembered Corrigan's heavy hand, the subtle threats, the favors exchanged. A cold sweat broke out on his brow as he realized that the seemingly insignificant requests for information weren't about veterans' rights at all. They were about him. And about Corrigan. Back at the sheriff's office, another email arrived. This one was from the Office of Special Counsel, requesting a full, unredacted list of all assets seized under forfeiture laws by the county sheriff's department in the last 7 years, along with their disposition. This hit too close to home. The forfeiture system was a cash cow for Corrigan, allowing him to seize property on often flimsy pretexts, auction it off, and use the proceeds to fund his department's slush fund, and, many suspected, his own lavish lifestyle. Corrigan slammed his fist on his desk. This is ridiculous. They can't just demand all our internal records like this. Sheriff, Miller began cautiously, if they're federal, they probably can. Maybe it's time to, maybe we should call our lawyers. Get ahead of this. A flicker of fear, quickly masked by bluster, crossed Corrigan's face. No. We've done nothing wrong. Just send them what they're asking for. Every damn piece of paper. Bury them in it. They'll get bored and go away. He still believed he could overwhelm them with bureaucracy, that their unseen power was limited to paperwork. He had no idea that every document, every email, every detail he grudgingly provided, was meticulously cross-referenced, analyzed, and used to paint an increasingly clear and damning picture of his absolute corruption. The invisible net was tightening. The initial annoyance that had plagued Sheriff Corrigan had curdled into genuine paranoia. The routine inquiries had stopped being about general protocols and were now pointedly specific, almost as if the unseen investigators knew exactly what they were looking for, and where to find it. They were requesting bank records of the sheriff's department, particularly those related to seized asset funds, detailed logs of judicial appointments, and even specific training records for deputies involved in particular arrests. What truly rattled Corrigan was the sudden, palpable shift in the local ecosystem of power. Judge Caldwell, once his steadfast ally, had become elusive. His calls went unanswered, and when they did finally connect, Caldwell's voice was tight, his answers clipped and uninformative. The judge had begun quietly rescheduling cases where Corrigan's deputies were heavily involved, or, more tellingly, recusing himself from cases that could draw federal attention. He was clearly attempting to distance himself, sensing the shift in the wind. "He's a rat," Corrigan fumed to Deputy Miller, pacing his office like a caged bear. "That damn Caldwell. Soon as the heat turns up a notch, he runs for cover. What are they even looking for, Hank? What could they possibly have?" Miller, whose own anxiety was growing, cleared his throat. "Sheriff, some of these questions, they're about the forfeiture cases. And those funds. And that Marcus Thorne business." He avoided Corrigan's gaze. Remember, his family kept making noise, even after he was locked up. And those land claims were, well, they were shaky. The mention of Marcus Thorne sent a chill down Corrigan's spine. That was a messy one, even by his standards. He had leveraged a dubious tip to seize Thorne's ancestral farm, a valuable piece of land that had conveniently ended up in the hands of one of Corrigan's political donors at a fraction of its market value. The drug charges against Thorne had been flimsy at best, based on planted evidence and a coerced confession. It was a case that had festered in the back of Corrigan's mind, a loose end he had thought long buried. What Corrigan didn't know was that Commander Thorne's team had meticulously reconstructed the Marcus Thorne case. They had found the original police reports, unredacted, revealing inconsistencies. They had cross-referenced the property transfer records, exposing the illegal sale of Thorne's land. They had even found the disappeared evidence logs, quietly recovered from a disgruntled, recently retired clerk who had kept a hidden duplicate. The key, however, came from the discreet interviews with other local landowners and small business owners, mostly minorities, who had similar stories of being targeted, losing assets, or facing trumped-up charges if they refused to cooperate with Corrigan's schemes. The investigation wasn't just about Corrigan anymore. It was about the entire local structure that had enabled him. Commander Thorne's team had uncovered a sophisticated, albeit localized, network of systemic corruption, a symbiotic relationship between Corrigan's office, Judge Caldwell's court, a few key local businesses, and even certain figures in the county zoning and land use departments. This network had systematically exploited the vulnerable, enriched its members, and stifled any dissent. Aaron, meanwhile, received only cryptic updates from Echo, but the subtle shift in the town's atmosphere was noticeable. The swagger of Corrigan's deputies seemed less pronounced. Whispers started to circulate in the diner and the gas station, hushed concerns about federal types asking questions, and things getting too hot. The invisible war was becoming perceptible, its pressure subtly reshaping the local landscape. One afternoon, a local journalist, Sarah Jenkins, whom Aaron knew to be fiercely independent, approached him hesitantly at the local coffee shop. She was pale, her hands trembling as she held her mug. "Mr. Banks," she began, her voice barely a whisper, have you heard anything about a federal investigation? Specifically, something about the sheriff's office and Judge Caldwell." Aaron met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Why do you ask, Sarah?" "I've been getting some anonymous tips," she confessed, glancing around nervously. "Files being leaked, strange questions being asked. They're talking about land deals, asset forfeitures, and that Marcus Thorne case. There's talk of a bigger picture, Mr. Banks. A whole system being involved." Aaron simply nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low, "when local systems fail, a higher one needs to step in to remind everyone of the true meaning of justice." He offered no further details, but the look in his eyes conveyed a silent, profound understanding. Sarah, a seasoned reporter, recognized the unspoken confirmation. The system that had protected Corrigan for so long was now beginning to crack under the relentless, unseen pressure. The fear that had once bound the community in silence was slowly being replaced by a cautious hope, and a growing realization that the sheriff's invincibility was an illusion. The stage was being set for the grand unveiling. The clock was ticking, and Sheriff Corrigan's carefully constructed empire was about to crumble. The tension in the courthouse that morning was so thick it was almost palpable. Sheriff Corrigan, though outwardly projecting his usual bluster, was a frayed nerve. The relentless, ever-tightening grip of the federal types had taken its toll. He paced his office, slamming the phone down after another unanswered call to Judge Caldwell. The judge, clearly sensing the coming storm, had abruptly taken medical leave, leaving Corrigan exposed. The final straw had come 2 days prior, an official subpoena, not from a local or state court, but from the U.S. Attorney's Office, demanding Corrigan's presence in federal court for an investigation into systemic abuses of power and public corruption. The wording was vague, yet terrifyingly precise. He still had no idea who was pulling the strings, but the scale of the threat was now undeniable. He had tried to leverage his local connections, but for the first time, his calls were met with silence or thinly veiled fear. His local network, once so robust, had evaporated. Aaron Banks was also in the courthouse, but his presence was unassuming. He sat in the public gallery, a quiet observer of the day's proceedings, which involved a mundane property dispute. His demeanor was calm, almost detached, but his senses were heightened. He had received a one-word text from Echo that morning, today. As the morning dragged on, the atmosphere outside the courthouse grew increasingly agitated. Local residents, drawn by rumors and a sense of impending drama, began to gather. Among them was Sarah Jenkins, her camera discreetly ready, a look of grim anticipation on her face. Even Maya, though still wary, had come at Aaron's quiet insistence, sitting a few rows behind him. Suddenly, a loud, urgent buzzing sound filled the air. It wasn't a fire alarm, but a sustained, electronic alert, the building-wide lockdown signal. Simultaneously, the large, ornate doors of the courtroom swung open. A uniformed bailiff, his face ashen, stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear. The first to enter were not local police, but figures in dark tactical gear, carrying automatic weapons, their faces obscured by helmets. They were the military special forces, moving with a silent, disciplined efficiency that spoke of relentless training. They secured the exits, their presence instantly neutralizing any thought of resistance. Local deputies, caught completely off guard, froze, their hands instinctively moving away from their sidearms as they were barked orders to stand down. Then, the second wave. Men and women in crisp, dark suits, moving with the same unwavering purpose. These were the military prosecutors, led by Commander Evelyn Thorne herself, her expression grim and utterly determined. She carried a thick, red-tabbed file, its contents heavy with the weight of justice long denied. Sheriff Corrigan, who had been lingering near the back of the courtroom, hoping to slip away, found himself trapped. His face drained of color as he saw Thorne. He didn't recognize her, but the authority radiating from her, and the silent, terrifying efficiency of her team, left no doubt. Sheriff Boyd Corrigan, Thorne's voice rang out, clear and resonant in the stunned silence, "You are hereby placed under arrest by order of the United States military justice system, for multiple counts of obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and public corruption, including but not limited to, the illegal seizure of property and the wrongful incarceration of U.S. Army veteran Marcus Thorne." Corrigan scoffed, attempting to regain some semblance of control, but his voice cracked. "This is ridiculous. You have no jurisdiction here. I'm a civilian law enforcement officer. Your claim of civilian status is irrelevant, Sheriff," Thorne countered, her voice unwavering. "Our jurisdiction extends to matters directly impacting U.S. military personnel, both active and retired, and to instances where local authorities demonstrate systemic failure to uphold the constitutional rights of all citizens, particularly when former service members or their families are targeted. Mr. Aaron Banks, a decorated Navy SEAL, initiated this inquiry after being personally targeted by your systematic abuse of power." At the mention of Aaron's name, Corrigan's eyes snapped to the gallery. Aaron stood slowly, his gaze meeting Corrigan's. There was no triumph, no malice, just a quiet, profound sense of resolve. He was the calm center of the storm he had unleashed. "You." Corrigan snarled, a guttural sound of pure hatred and disbelief escaping him. "You did this. You brought these soldiers into my town." Thorne ignored him, turning to two burly military police officers. "Take him into custody." As the MPs moved forward, Corrigan lunged, a desperate, final act of defiance. He pushed past a startled deputy, attempting to make a break for a side door, but was quickly intercepted by the disciplined Special Forces operatives. He struggled, a pathetic figure, his authority completely stripped away. This was the full, unvarnished scene from the prologue. The same struggle, the same despair. The same raw, uncomprehending rage. Two roped military police officers in Marine Corps uniforms took him firmly by the arms. Corrigan struggled desperately, trying to break free, but their grip was iron. He gasped for air, his words devolving into an incoherent mumble. In that moment, Commander Thorne moved forward, holding up a large, bound file. "The evidence, Sheriff," she stated, her voice sharp with finality, "is overwhelming. Testimony from dozens of victims, detailed financial records, forensic analysis of altered documents, and even encrypted communications from your own subordinates, detailing years of your criminal enterprise. You believed yourself untouchable. You believed you could hide behind local politics and intimidation. You were tragically mistaken." Corrigan let out a hoarse, desperate cry as he was dragged toward the exit. His gaze, wild and broken, darted to Aaron Banks, full of hatred, but also a dawning, terrible understanding. The door slammed shut, separating him from the world he once unilaterally controlled, now a world that had turned irrevocably against him. The storm was over, but the fallout was just beginning. In the immediate aftermath of Sheriff Corrigan's arrest, the courthouse buzzed with a mixture of shock, relief, and a profound sense of disbelief. Commander Thorne and her team moved with efficiency, sealing off the sheriff's office and seizing all departmental records. Judge Caldwell, appearing pale and shaken, was found attempting to shred documents in his chambers and was promptly taken into custody by federal marshals, who had arrived in coordination with Thorne's operation. His medical leave was swiftly converted into an involuntary one, under federal escort. Outside, the gathered crowd, initially stunned into silence, erupted into a cacophony of murmurs, cheers, and even some tears. Sarah Jenkins, her hands shaking but her eyes alight with purpose, was already furiously typing on her phone, relaying the incredible events to her editor. Maya, tears streaming down her face, turned to Aaron, embracing him tightly. "It's over," she whispered, "it's really over." Aaron held her, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. "Not quite, Maya. But the worst of it is, the military justice system, once activated, operated with a speed and impartiality that was alien to the slow, politicized mechanisms of the local court. Sheriff Corrigan and Judge Caldwell were immediately transported to a secure federal facility. Within days, a special grand jury, convened under federal jurisdiction with JAG prosecutors presenting the case, began hearing evidence. Commander Thorne's team, working tirelessly, laid out the full scope of Corrigan's and Caldwell's corruption. The trial, when it began, was not held in the county courthouse, but in a federal district court, far removed from local influence. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Commander Thorne herself led the prosecution, her voice cold and precise as she detailed years of abuse. The Marcus Thorne case, forensic accounting revealed the illegal land seizure, the manipulated drug charges, and the subsequent fraudulent sale of the veteran's farm to a shell company secretly owned by one of Corrigan's close associates. Marcus Thorne, now released, gave a tearful testimony, recounting his years of wrongful incarceration and the destruction of his family. Systematic civil rights violations, a parade of witnesses, predominantly black residents and low-income individuals, recounted stories of false arrests, excessive force, and the targeted harassment that had kept them in constant fear. Aaron's sister, Maya, bravely testified about her own experience, providing a clear example of the judicial bias. Financial misconduct, detailed bank statements and ledger entries exposed a vast network of illicit financial transactions, showing how asset forfeiture funds were routinely siphoned off for personal gain, and how local businesses received preferential treatment in exchange for kickbacks. Obstruction of justice, evidence was presented of shredded documents, deleted computer files, and coerced testimonies, all orchestrated by Corrigan and facilitated by Caldwell to hide their crimes. The defense offered little. Corrigan's legal team, hired with rapidly dwindling funds and facing an overwhelming prosecution, could only argue lack of jurisdiction, a plea swiftly dismissed by the federal judge. Corrigan himself remained defiant, alternating between furious outbursts and stony silence, convinced to the very end that he was being unfairly targeted. The verdict, when it came, was swift and absolute. Sheriff Boyd Corrigan was found guilty on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy to violate civil rights, multiple counts of obstruction of justice, and numerous charges of public corruption. Judge Caldwell, facing overwhelming evidence of his complicity, pleaded guilty to several lesser charges in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence, but his career and reputation were utterly destroyed. Corrigan was sentenced to a substantial term in federal prison, stripped of his pension, and ordered to pay millions in restitution to his victims. His empire, built on fear and corruption, had collapsed entirely. His co-conspirators, those local officials and businessmen who had benefited from his schemes, were also investigated. Some faced criminal charges, others saw their businesses collapse under public scrutiny and federal penalties. The local police department underwent a complete overhaul. Commander Thorne's team remained in the county for weeks, overseeing the dismissal of corrupt deputies, establishing new oversight mechanisms, and implementing comprehensive ethics training. A new sheriff, brought in from outside the county, was appointed with a mandate to restore public trust. Aaron Banks watched the news reports from his quiet home. The sense of justice achieved was profound, a deep, resonant hum in his soul. He had not sought personal revenge, he had sought systemic rectification. And he had gotten it. The final image on the news showed Marcus Thorne, standing on his restored farm, his arm around his family, a tentative smile on his face. Behind him, the setting sun cast long shadows over fields that were once stolen, now reclaimed. It was a testament to what could happen when a hidden mechanism of justice was activated, bringing down an entire corrupt edifice. The fight for justice was never truly over, but sometimes, a decisive battle could be won, reminding everyone that no one, no matter how powerful, was truly above the law. In the months that followed Corrigan's downfall, the ripples of the federal intervention spread wide and deep throughout the county. The initial shock gave way to a wave of collective introspection and, for many, a sense of liberation. The once whispered fears were now openly discussed, fostering a fragile but growing sense of community and empowerment. Aaron Banks, true to his nature, did not bask in the spotlight. His role was complete, the hidden mechanism, having served its purpose. However, he couldn't simply walk away. The systemic changes he had initiated required continued, albeit quiet, guidance. He joined a newly formed, federally backed community oversight board, operating discreetly to ensure the reforms took root. His expertise in systems, honed in the most complex environments, proved invaluable. The new sheriff, Chief Miller, no relation to the former Deputy Miller, who had been cleared of direct corruption but dismissed for complicity, a no-nonsense former big city police commander with an impeccable record, arrived with a mandate to rebuild trust. He immediately implemented transparent policies, established a civilian review board, and mandated extensive anti-bias training for all officers. The county's budget, once a murky pool of discretionary funds, was now subject to strict federal oversight, ensuring that asset forfeiture proceeds genuinely benefited the community, rather than illicit personal accounts. Judge Caldwell's replacement was a young, ethically uncompromising federal judge, temporarily assigned to oversee the transition and ensure fairness. His presence sent a clear message: the federal government was watching, and the days of backroom deals and prejudiced rulings were over. Maya, though still bearing the scars of her experience, found a new strength. She became an outspoken advocate for civil rights, lending her voice and her story to local initiatives pushing for police reform and judicial accountability. Her nursing license was reinstated, and she resumed her career with renewed vigor, now a symbol of resilience in the community. She joined Aaron on the oversight board, bringing a vital ground-level perspective. The impact of Protocol Omega extended beyond the individuals. It served as a stark, public reminder to other local jurisdictions across the country that systemic corruption, especially when it touched upon the rights of military personnel or fundamentally undermined the rule of law, would not be tolerated. Commander Thorne, satisfied that justice had been served, returned to her regular duties, but the success of the operation solidified her reputation as an unyielding force for accountability. One quiet evening, Aaron and Maya sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the now peaceful town. The air was cool, the silence profound. "Do you think it will last?" Maya asked, a touch of weariness in her voice. "This change, I mean. Or will another Corrigan just rise up eventually?" Aaron took a sip of his coffee. "Change isn't a destination, Maya. It's a continuous process. There will always be those who seek power and try to corrupt the system. But now, the people here know what's possible. They know there are mechanisms, even hidden ones, for justice. And they know that silence is no longer an option." He looked out at the tranquil night. The most powerful weapon against tyranny isn't a gun, it's a functioning, impartial system of justice. And a few determined individuals willing to activate it. The story of Sheriff Corrigan and the Navy SEAL became a local legend, a cautionary tale for those who would abuse power, and a beacon of hope for those who sought justice. The catharsis was deep, Not just for Aaron and Maya, but for an entire community that had long lived under the shadow of unchecked authority. The sun had set on one era of corruption, and a new, more just dawn had begun. The system had been cleansed, for now, a testament to the fact that even the most deeply entrenched power structures could be dismantled, piece by meticulous piece, by the quiet, strategic activation of a higher, unassailable truth.